Hey everybody. So today we're going to be looking at the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme. Made a lot of headlines in 2008 when the scheme first came unraveled. And so we're going to try to look at some of the less talked about parts of it. Everybody read the headlines, biggest Ponzi scheme ever. Everybody knows the basics, but I really want to try to delve into some of the less known facts about the case. So we're going to properly define the size of a Ponzi scheme. There's a few ways to uh, to rank these Ponzi schemes in size. And we're going to talk about the different outcomes for investors based off of when they put their money in and when they withdrew their money. Those things have very important legal implications, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the amount and timing of the distribution of the seized funds, which is another pretty interesting side of the story. This is a picture from The Wizard of Lies. If you haven't seen it, it's a HBO show with Robert De Niro. It's actually really good, and it tells you some of the technical side, but it's mostly just a real good little miniseries. Okay, so the big number that's always at the top of the headlines is the 65 billion Ponzi scheme, biggest Ponzi scheme ever. That's what everybody read in the news. And so basically, what that number is it is the initial inflows into the fund as well as the gains of the fund. So Madoff hadn't been making real investments since around 1995 or 1996. So that means that roughly 12 years from 96 to 2008, he wasn't actually investing any of his clients' money. And so the total amount of inflows, as mentioned right here, is around 17 billion. So the difference between 65 billion and 17 billion, that difference is what the gains would have been, assuming the money had actually been invested. And the annual return that his filings that he sent out to his clients, it pretty much always averaged around a 12% annual return, which I mean, is solid. That's better than the market average of around 10%. But I think even in the mid 2000s, that was still beating the market. But I wanted to just check the math real quick. And as you can see, 12 years at 12% return compounding times initial 17 billion investment gives us about the mid 60 billion range. And obviously, some people put in money earlier, and some people put money in later. But the numbers seem to check out just as a back of the hand calculation. So yeah, over 3/4 of that 64 billion is just gains that never happened that people thought happened. So it's pretty interesting. So this is probably the most fascinating part. So in 2008, when it came undone, they assigned obviously a lot of prosecutors to try and recoup as much of the money as possible and return it to the victims. But this is kind of a complicated thing in the legal world because there is a statute of limitations on clawing back money in suits like this when somebody wasn't aware, and it really depends on state. So I'm just going to read this to you here. Section 544 of the United States Bankruptcy Code: a trustee may avoid fraudulent conveyances based upon applicable state law. In Pennsylvania, it's 4 years. Some states have longer ones. For example, in New York, where the Madoff Ponzi scheme occurred, it's 6 years. Um, and actually, it's really thankful that it is 6 years. I went and looked at a list of all of the clawback time frames, and 6 years is the longest one with New York right here. And that is tied with a few other states. I think Maine also has a 6 year one, but all other states are less than that. And basically, what this means is that if you withdrew money uh, before 2002 in this case, which would be 6 years before the unraveling of the Ponzi scheme, then that means you got to keep both your initial investment as well as your gains, which means that you fall into this third very lucky category. So you just happen to arbitrarily be lucky enough to have withdrawn early enough that they can't legally come after you and take back the money that you withdrew. So now we're going to look at this category of people, which is the retained investment category. So these are people who withdrew their money at some point between 2002 and 2008 within the 6-year time frame. So the prosecutor went after these people, but he couldn't go after their initial investment and divide that up among the people who actually lost part of their initial investment. And so I'll just read a little bit about the difference between those two, about if you're eligible to keep your gains versus your initial investment. So the courts have made a distinction between the redemption of initial investments and of false profits. In order for the trustee or receiver to be able to claw back payments that constituted and initial, there must be evidence of actual fraud. However, when the trustee or receiver is seeking the redemption of false profits, the standard only requires proof of constructive fraud, regardless if the case requires proof of actual or constructive fraud. Generally, the trustee or receiver can easily meet this burden, especially in the case of a Ponzi scheme, which is by its nature fraudulent. So the court ruled that, and this has, I think, been a common ruling for hundreds of years in courts, that we're not going to punish these people who withdrew early by taking some of their initial investment away from them. We're just going to take away their gains, which it might be fair. I guess it kind of depends how you look at it. If you really, I mean, another way to distribute everything would be to take all the people who ever had anything to do with Bernie Madoff and made any money off of him, and claw back everything and then just distribute it evenly among everybody. But obviously, when you're looking back decades and stuff like that, it ends up getting hard to get paperwork and stuff, and things get complicated. And that's why statute of limitation laws like this exist. It's just to kind of simplify things, as well as other reasons. Statute of limitations just themselves are very fascinating. But in this case, it was very good that New York's is 6 years. That definitely saved a few $1 billion that got to be distributed to the people in this category, because these people are the ones that definitely got hurt the worst. They really got screwed over hard. So yeah, so that's a side of the case people don't know. A significant amount of investors made money if they got in early enough and they got out early enough. That seems to be the key with any type of scam. So now we're going to talk about the payouts. So as we read earlier, of the 17 billion invested, around 9 or 10 billion has been recovered. Some of it was put in foreign bank accounts. Some of it was tied up in real estate of the main people who ran Bernie Madoff stuff. But from the reading I did on how they actually distributed the funds, it was a pro rata distribution, which means that it was proportional to everybody who invested. So if you're somebody who invested $100, or if you're somebody who invested $1 million, say that the first pro rata interim distribution went out to just those two people, and it was $100. Then the person who invested 100 would get half of his 100, he would get 50, and the person who invested $1 million would also get $50. And so basically, doing distributions in this fashion, it really helps the people who invested less money, which more often than not, those are the people who suffered the worst. They have, they invested often their entire life savings with Bernie Madoff, and they got hit the hardest, and they literally lost everything. So some people might disagree that this is fair. Some people think that maybe it should be a distribution based off the amount that you put in, but that would definitely hurt the smaller fish who are involved in this fund. So this is very interesting right here. So once the last distribution is finished, which we just had the 8th one of these, there's been a ton of these over the years. The first one was in 2011, I'm pretty sure, and then the last one was in 2017. So once all those distributions are finished, anyone who had a claim of 1.25 million or less received all of their initial investment back, which is really good. These are a lot of the small mom and pop investors who really lost everything, and it's nice to see that at least they got back their initial investment, or at least part of their initial investment, if it was more than 1.25 million. So this is another very interesting thing that I stumbled across. So JP Morgan Chase, who, as far as I can tell, I think they directed some of their clients to invest into Madoff to earn some fees, or they just generally kind of overlooked what Madoff was doing. They didn't delve too deeply into just kind of what was going on in his fund. and they ended up settling for, I think, around $2 billion. Yeah, the bank agreed to forfeit 1.7 billion, the largest forfeiture ever imposed in the American financial history, which is pretty interesting. So they were somewhat complicit in this. Basically, they knew what was going on. But yeah, as you know, if you're a big bank and you have enough money to settle a case, you're going to settle a case. And something else interesting here, the bank signed a deferred prosecution agreement, the first ever imposed on a major New York City bank. And this just says that, I mean, it's just like it says. They agreed to pay a settlement to not be prosecuted criminally, I'm pretty sure. So very interesting. And as we can see, we have Preet Bharara making a making an appearance here, and he's now the FCC chairman, who's has a lot of people angry at him over the net neutrality stuff that's been going on lately. So that's been very interesting to follow. But yeah, so I hope you learned something from this, and I think it's pretty interesting. Definitely do some research. I'm including all the links of most of the websites that I went to. Definitely all the ones that I just directly took text from. And it's a very interesting case. It's crazy that Madoff was so embedded into the financial industry. Like he was chairman of NASDAQ, chairman and president of a few other organizations. And his fund just kept growing and growing and got bigger and bigger. And still, no one figured it out until the financial industry collapsed in 2008. That was what brought him down. It wasn't any good investigating by journalists or by prosecutors. It was just that he ran out of money to pay off people who were withdrawing money and basically turned himself in. So it's crazy you can get that big and not get caught nowadays in the very center of the financial universe. So thanks for listening, and I hope you learned something.